My name is Ilaria, and at the age of 42, I have finally found that shaky, almost fragile peace that so often seems impossible after experiencing grief, after those storms that uproot the foundations of the familiar world and leave a void in my soul that echoes in the quietest moments of the morning. It was not easy to get to this inner world, to this balance felt at my fingertips. Especially after I lost Filippo 3 years ago, my husband, my friend, my companion in countless seemingly eternal conversations about life, books, movies, where we will go in the spring and what we should choose the color for the new curtain in the living room. We were together for 15 years, long, intense, sometimes difficult, but always filled with love, and to this day, especially in the quiet hours of dawn, I find myself reaching for his side of the bed, as if my body remembers the habit, even if my mind has long known that there is no one else support. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. Filippo left me everything, our bright, spacious house with a terrace and garden in a cozy suburb, where every morning begins with birdsong and the smell of freshly baked bread, and about $700,000 in savings, investments, and insurance payments, carefully planned by him long before the word cancer ceased to be just a scary concept and became our everyday the enemy. I know that for many it will seem like a significant sum, a gift of fate, unexpected luck, but believe me, I would give every penny, without the slightest hesitation, just to return it, even if it was just one day, one last conversation, one farewell I love you. Nevertheless, as is often the case with women left alone, I had to learn to live anew, to build my reality in a new way, and I managed to create a comfortable, albeit slightly lonely existence for myself. I work as a HR manager at a large technology company in the city center, go to the gym 3 times a week. Once a month, I update my hair color at my favorite salon and, most surprisingly for myself, I have learned to truly enjoy my own company, evenings with a book and a glass of wine, and morning silence that nothing breaks. My parents, however, don't understand this. It seems to them that my life is empty, that behind the external calm and financial stability lies exhaustion, loneliness, which I simply refuse to admit. Mom calls it a vicious circle of fatigue, while Dad, as always, just nods in response to everything she says, as if in their 45-year marriage, he decided long ago that it was better not to argue with her. They can't understand why I didn't remarry, because, as my mother says almost every time we meet, you're still young enough to find someone. Ilaria, you're only 42, this isn't the end, and maybe even the beginning, and, of course, she forgets to add, and it's not too late to have children, you know, there are options these days. I visit them once a month, always on Sunday. It's a 2-hour drive along a narrow, winding highway, which I put off until the last, and each time with an inner sigh I force myself to get in the car, turn on the navigator and go back to that house where the walls store the smell of old magazines, antique furniture and its endless expectations. As soon as I cross the threshold, the interrogation begins, hidden behind the care wrapper. Disguised as simple conversations over lunch. Ilaria, I met Susan Rossetti at the Bridge Club, Mom will say, pretending that her voice is just sharing the news, although there is always a special tinge of anticipation in it. Her son Giovanni is now divorced. He is an accountant, but her mother prefers not to talk about the fact that Giovanni Rossetti, at 39, still lives in the basement of her own house and has not worked for the last 3 years. I realized a long time ago that all these sons of my mother's friends are looking not so much for a wife as for free food and a roof over their heads. Thanks, Mom, but I'm not interested in dating right now, is my standard response, learned to the point of automatism and always pronounced with that polite but firm intonation that puts an end to it, but does not cause a quarrel. Last Sunday's visit started as usual. I arrived at noon, helped my mom with lunch, put napkins and rings as always and served her signature lasagna on the table, and prepared for another round of questioning. But something was different. This time, no one mentioned Giovanni or any other marriageable bachelors. Instead, there was a strange, oppressive silence at lunch, unusual for our family, where the conversation usually does not stop even during meals. I finally asked, wary, noticing how Mom and Dad exchanged glances, as if deciding which of them would take responsibility for voicing something important. Mom folded the napkin carefully, ran her fingers over it, and said, "We're worried about your brother." This phrase immediately caught my attention. Leonardo is my younger brother, who is 35 years old, 7 years younger than me. Unlike me, he always followed the traditional path, striving for stability, for approval, for family comfort. He married Vanessa 3 years ago, a beautiful, friendly girl whom my parents adored from day one, almost immediately starting to call her our sweet Vanessa. She was polite, non-confrontational, and most importantly, she dreamed of a big family, which, in her mother's opinion, was perhaps the main advantage of a woman. I asked, feeling anxiety growing in my chest. The Pope quietly said that Leonardo had lost his job. The company he had worked for the past 5 years had carried out a large-scale reduction, and he was one of the first to be hit. Now, according to Dad, he and Vanessa cannot pay the rent of their apartment, and at the end of the month they will most likely be evicted. I nodded, slowly, almost resignedly, already sensing where this conversation was heading, as if the script had been written in advance and I just had to wait for the lines. They need to stop somewhere, Mom said, and her voice, soft and anxious at first, suddenly became tougher, more demanding, as if she had moved from a request to an order, until Leonardo finds a new job and they save up money for rent. I sighed, almost soundlessly, knowing how it would all end. Mom, you know how he is. Leonardo has always been a bit chaotic, and I'm used to living alone. Mom replied sharply, he's your brother. The family helps the family, and Vanessa is a good girl. She will help around the house. They won't give you any trouble, but I doubted it. Leonardo has always been a favorite, but his spontaneity, eternal disorganization, and flight of nature have hardly disappeared in recent years, and Vanessa, despite all her gentleness, I knew superficially. How long will they have to stay there? I asked, although deep down I already felt that I would not like the answer to this question, that behind my mother's gentle assurances and rehearsed slight anxiety there was something much longer and more burdensome than a few weeks. Mom, without taking her eyes off me, insisted that it was only temporary, 3 months at most, no more, dear, because Leonardo already has some very promising leads. You'll see, everything will be settled soon. And although her voice was full of confidence, doubt grew in me. I knew how unstable the pharmaceutical industry has become in recent years, how easily companies have laid off entire departments without batting an eye, and how difficult it is to find decent work at the age of 40, especially when you don't have connections and a powerful professional network. Please, Ilaria. Mom leaned across the table and squeezed my hand tightly. Her voice became quiet, almost pleading, and despite all the inner uncertainty, I already felt that I was beginning to give in. We would take them in, really, but we just don't have the space or conditions, she added, and it was true. Their tiny 2-room apartment with a cramped kitchen lit by a weak lamp under the ceiling and creaking closet doors could hardly accommodate 2 more adults. And there was plenty of room in my house, and it was this knowledge, stubbornly surfacing in my thoughts, that made me, after almost an hour of doubt, internal remorse and unsuccessful attempts to find a convenient excuse to refuse, finally say, okay, they can temporarily stay with me, but we must agree on some rules in advance. Mom's face flushed with relief, and she immediately reached for the phone. Oh, thank you, darling, you can't imagine what a relief that is, she said, already dialing the number. Leonardo will be so grateful. I'll call him right now. Dad, always a silent observer, touched me on the shoulder and warmly said, this is my girl. He's lucky to have a sister like that. I smiled faintly, realizing that I had made the right, but by no means an easy choice, and already internally preparing for the fact that these few months could turn into anything but calm. But how bad can it be, right? A few months with my brother and his wife under the same roof. I can handle it. I've already dealt with much worse. Exactly a week after that conversation, on a Friday evening, when the city was enveloped in a warm sunset and the muffled noise of traffic jams could be heard on the streets, Leonardo and Vanessa appeared on my doorstep, burdened with 4 bulky suitcases, a package of homemade ficus and a cautious, almost guilty joy in their eyes. Little sister, Leonardo exclaimed, hugging me with his usual warmth. His cologne, saturated with woody notes, reminded me of childhood, of those times when we quarreled over toys, and then reconciled under a promise not to tell my mother. Thank you very much. We promise that we will be quiet and won't be a burden to you. Vanessa, neat, with her blonde hair pulled back into a high ponytail, looked tired, but there was genuine gratitude in her voice. We can't thank you enough, Ilaria, it means a lot to us. I took them inside, showed them the guest room on the ground floor, cozy, with a soft gray-blue blanket and a view of the garden, and, handing Leonardo a bunch of keys, said, "Make yourself at home." I had already cleared a couple of shelves in the kitchen cabinets, thoughtfully made space in the bathroom, and hoped that this gesture would show them that I was really ready to accept them without reproach. "That's so generous of you," Vanessa said, looking around the room. "I'll be happy to help you while we're here. I can cook and clean, really, and I even like it." "That would be great," I replied, feeling a little relieved, "because if everything goes that way, maybe this period will even be pleasant." I added, "I usually come home around 6, and cooking is not my strong suit." "Don't worry, Ilaria, I'll take care of it," Vanessa smiled, and her voice sounded confident and encouraging. We agreed that I would buy groceries, and while they were looking for work, they would take care of the house, cooking, cleaning, and minor household tasks. I also mentioned that smart thermostats and LED lighting were installed in the house, thanks to which bills always remained within reasonable limits, and asked them to be careful with the use of resources. The first few weeks were surprisingly quiet. I was returning from work and felt the house, once filled with echoing silence, come alive. Vanessa greeted me with the warm aromas of a freshly prepared dinner, tender lasagna, spicy vegetables, soups with crispy croutons. All this was created with attention and taste. The house was tidy, the floors were clean, the dust was wiped off, and there were almost always fresh flowers in a vase on the table. Leonardo enthusiastically talked about his job search, showed his resume, which he updated for each vacancy, and seemed sincerely determined to start all over again. To my surprise, I began to enjoy the presence of other people in the house. After so many years of solitude, it was even nice to hear someone laughing in the living room or sharing news about an article they had read. But after about a month, I began to notice changes, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but increasingly persistent. Dinner, which used to greet me immediately upon my return, now appeared less and less often, and sometimes did not appear at all. The kitchen, which had been sparkling clean, now remained unpacked until late at night, and I increasingly found breakfast dishes in the sink. One Tuesday, I came home, tired after a long meeting, and found that the kitchen had remained untouched since morning. I made myself a sandwich, sat down to eat alone, and felt something sticky begin to form in my chest. Not irritation, not yet, but not calmness either. Around 7:30, the door finally opened, and Leonardo and Vanessa entered, talking animatedly about something. "Oh, you've already eaten," Vanessa said, glancing at me briefly and dropping the shopping bags on the kitchen counter. "Yes, I thought you were busy," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral, not betraying either annoyance or reproach. I asked when Leonardo took a bottle of beer out of the fridge without looking at me. "Just running errands," he said, as if it were a matter of course. I noticed that Vanessa's bags were from expensive stores, the ones whose windows I usually only looked at from the outside, passing by on my way home from work, brands that, even with my fairly stable salary as a manager at a reputable company, remained more an exception for a special occasion than a part of everyday life. Strong seams, fashionable shades, thin skin, and the unmistakable shine of new things. All this screamed about a recent purchase, and despite my desire not to interfere, I increasingly found myself asking a question that became obsessive: how can they even afford such shopping sprees if they can't pay the rent and live with me temporarily? The next evening turned out to be almost a mirror image of the previous one. I returned home to the empty, untidy kitchen, to the emptiness flooded with golden light, where there was no smell of dinner, no noise of conversation, or even traces of someone's efforts. The table was covered with crumbs, there were dried traces of morning coffee on the stove, and there were dishes in the sink that no one even thought to do. I warmed up the leftover vegetable stew I'd made over the weekend and had dinner alone by the kitchen island, feeling my irritation, faint at first, almost unformulated, now turn into a dense ball of displeasure, when a couple burst through the door around 8 o'clock in the evening, Vanessa with a phone in her hand and Leonardo with a backpack. I decided that I couldn't delay the conversation any longer. "I thought we agreed on dinner and cleaning," I said, trying to speak calmly but firmly, arranging the words like chips in a board game that was becoming increasingly difficult for me to play alone. Vanessa rolled her eyes theatrically and sank into a chair with a loud, exaggerated sigh. "I've been very busy lately," she said, as if that could explain everything. "I'm starting a business with friends." We're meeting here in the afternoon to plan everything, she paused and added, looking at me a little reproachfully, you're inviting people to your place. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from her words, but from the tone with which they were uttered, as if it were not a request, not an attempt to explain, but something more, a challenge, a claim, an insult. It's just a few friends, Vanessa continued with a shrug. We needed to meet somewhere. I put my fork down on the table, trying not to clap it, and looking directly at her, I said, Vanessa, this is my house. I do not know these people. I feel uncomfortable when there are strangers here. Especially when I'm not at home, she replied sharply. They are not strangers, they are my friends. They're strangers to me, I snapped. If you want to date them, you'd better go to a coffee shop or to one of their homes. Vanessa looked at me intently, and there was something in her gaze that I hadn't noticed before, something cold, stubborn, and maybe even contemptuous. She dropped her fork on her plate with a clatter that seemed too loud to me in this former house of silence, abruptly pushed away from the table and went into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her with such desperation, as if I had just upset the delicate balance of the world. Leonardo, who had been silent all this time, looked at me with open irritation. Well done, little sister, she's trying to build something here, I sighed. Leonardo, I'm not trying to be complicated, but I began, but he didn't even listen, just got up and followed her, leaving me in the same kitchen, with an unfinished dinner and a booming feeling that something had gone completely wrong. Since that evening, the atmosphere in the house has changed beyond recognition. Vanessa started acting as if I simply didn't exist. No morning greetings, no usual how was your day, not even a nod when meeting. She completely stopped cooking for everyone. There was not even a hint of participation in the conduct of everyday life. I would come home and find either empty takeout containers hastily thrown in the trash, or dirty pots left on the stove as a silent reproach, as a reminder of someone's laziness. I had no choice but to go back to cooking the food myself, as it was before they appeared. Sometimes I even missed the old quiet evenings, when the only sound was the rustle of pages or light music, and no one intruded into my order. 2 months after they moved in, I began to feel like a stranger in my own house, in the walls that I painted with my own hands, in the rooms where every object had its own story, where every corner held memories of Filippo and our lives. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw them sprawled on the couch, with pizza in a box, the TV on, and complete disregard for me. They didn't even offer me pizza. That was the last straw. I stood in the doorway and said, "Hi guys, a quick question. How's the job search going?" Leonardo, almost without looking up from the screen, muttered indifferently, "Well, progress," I pressed, trying not to break down, but my voice was already getting sharper. He shrugged his shoulders. There were several interviews, nothing serious yet. Vanessa didn't even turn around. It's been 2 months, I reminded him. When you moved in, we agreed that it was temporary. Leonardo frowned, not looking at me. We'll let you know when we have any news, he said, as if I were a hired agent who had violated his contract. He turned back to the TV, and the conversation was over. The following Sunday, as usual, I went to my parents for our monthly visit, and to my surprise, I felt relieved that Leonardo and Vanessa refused to join. It gave me the opportunity to talk to Mom and Dad in private. Mom hugged me at the entrance and asked, "How are Leonardo and Vanessa doing?" I knew right away that this was the right moment. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," I began, but before I could continue, Mom interrupted me. "Leonardo says you're putting pressure on them, making them feel unwanted," she said accusingly. "He says you treat them like they're bothering you." I was stunned. "What?" I gasped. "I barely mentioned it. I was just asking how the job search was going." Dad, who was sitting with a newspaper, quietly added, "This is not like you, Ilaria." I tried to hold on, explained that they had promised to help around the house, and Vanessa had stopped doing anything a long time ago, that she had invited people without telling me, and that the atmosphere had become unbearable. Mom shook her head. "They're having a hard time right now, Ilaria, you should be more understanding." "Understanding?" I asked, and although I tried to remain calm, I felt a heavy, barely suppressed wave of irritation rise in my chest. They live in my house, a house that I keep paying for, a house that is rented not by someone abstract, but by me, out of my hard-earned money, and I buy all the food, pay all the bills, while receiving in return not gratitude, but complaints and disregard. Dad, Hearing the note in my voice that I usually reserved for particularly difficult job interviews, said firmly, "They're a family, Ilaria, and the family supports each other." I froze, realizing at that moment how deeply ingrained this belief was in the minds of my parents, as if, having given them shelter, a roof over their heads, daily dinners, and the opportunity to live without worries, I still owed them. It became clear to me that it was pointless to argue. They've already decided everything for themselves. Mom looked at me as if I had failed them. Failed to live up to some kind of silent expectation, as if I lacked generosity, breadth of soul, or maybe patience. I suddenly felt small, like when I was a child, when they scolded me for a bad grade or an impolite tone, and swallowing the insult, I just nodded, changing the subject so as not to slip into a meaningless squabble. We had an awkward dinner, talking about the weather, the news, and more speculation about the neighbors' lives, and soon I excused myself and went home, hoping for silence and solitude as a salvation. But as I drove up to the house, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. There was an unfamiliar car in my parking spot, a dark blue SUV without of-state license plates. I frowned, parked on the street and entered the house. As soon as the door opened, I saw several large suitcases in the hallway, as if someone had just arrived from a long trip and was going to stay for a long time. There were voices coming from the living room. And it wasn't just Leonardo and Vanessa's voices. I entered and saw an elderly couple sitting comfortably on my couch, with cups in their hands, among blankets, decorative pillows and my personal space. I recognized them immediately, Robert and Linda, Vanessa's parents, whom I had met only a couple of times on family holidays, and only briefly. When I appeared in the doorway, the conversation instantly died down. Leonardo, feigning joy, got up and said, "Ilaria, look who's here to visit." I put on a polite smile, feeling everything inside begin to shrink with indignation. "Hello, Robert, Linda, I'm glad to see you," I said automatically. Linda nodded with the same expression I've often seen on women who've just rated someone's kitchen as very nice if you like country style. "Ilaria," I looked at my brother. "Leonardo, can I talk to you for a minute?" I asked, trying to sound polite, even though rage was already bubbling in my chest. He frowned at my look, but got up anyway and followed me upstairs to my office, the only space that was still untouchable. As soon as we entered, I shut the door firmly behind me. "What's going on?" I asked. "Why are Vanessa's parents here with their suitcases?" Leonardo scratched his head and looked away. "They just came to stay for a week. Don't worry, they're going to Arizona to see Vanessa's brother, and they decided to stop by on the way, and you didn't even think to warn me?" My voice became quieter, but there was a steely tension in it. "This is my house, Leonardo. You can't just invite people here without my knowledge." He spread his hands. "I know, sorry, but they're already here. What do you want me to do? Sent them to the hotel?" He spoke reproachfully, as if I were endangering the health of the elderly. I looked at his face, familiar, but now alien, as if he had forgotten who was really making all this possible. "Okay," I breathed, "1 week, no more." Leonardo's face lit up. "Thank you, little sister, you're the best." We went downstairs, and I immediately noticed a change. Vanessa had cooked dinner again. After weeks of ignoring it, she suddenly became a polite hostess again. Obviously, the arrival of her parents reminded her how to behave. We all sat down at the table. I tried to keep my composure, as if this dinner was another corporate meeting with a potentially toxic client. "Ilaria," Linda began, her voice soft but with an icy note of appreciation, "you really have a wonderful home. How many bedrooms are there?" 4, I answered shortly, taking a sip of water. "And you live here all alone?" Robert asked, with the same curiosity that anyone would have when they'd just entered someone else's life with a suitcase. "Yes," I said. "Filippo left me everything after he died. I didn't like talking about it, especially with strangers, especially at the dinner table. Such a big house for one person," Linda said, rolling her eyes as if she was doing herself a favor by stating the obvious. "How are you coping with its contents?" "I'm doing fine," I replied shortly, not wanting to continue this interrogation. Linda exchanged glances with Robert, and I could almost hear a plan forming in their minds. "You know," she said slowly, "if I had a house this size, I'd probably sell it. There's too much room for one person, and the money could be spent on other family members." I almost choked. "I beg your pardon?" I said, peering into her face. I mean, she added, pretending that her words were just friendly advice, that you could sell this house, give, say, half to your brother so that he and Vanessa could buy something of their own. And take something smaller for themselves, according to age, so to speak. At that moment, my breath caught in my throat, such outright audacity, such self-confident arrogance, bursting into my house, into my life, as if I were just the temporary mistress of these walls. I looked directly at Linda, feeling my skin freeze. When you have your own house, Linda, you can manage it however you want, you can sell it, you can give it away, but this house is mine, and I'm not going to sell it. There was silence at the table. Robert stared at his plate, Linda pursed her lips, Vanessa shot me a look full of indignation and contempt, as if I hadn't lived up to her expectations. We finished dinner almost in silence, and I counted the minutes until the moment when I could be alone again, in my house, in my space, in my truth. The next week turned into a real ordeal, an endless test of my patience and the limits of my self-worth, as if everyone around me conspired to remind me that I was not the mistress of this house, but just a temporary obstacle to other people's comforts. Every time I entered a room, the conversation was instantly cut off, and faces turned with strained smiles or distant glances, as if I were trespassing on someone else's territory, even though it was my kitchen, my living room, my bedroom, my walls, my house. Linda and Robert, who seemed to genuinely take their stay here for granted, asked increasingly insistent and tactless questions about my job, my salary, whether it was too lonely to live alone, whether I regretted not giving birth, and, of course, whether I think it's time to do something useful with this house. They treated my house like a middle-class hotel. Wet towels were strewn on the bathroom floor, dishes with breakfast leftovers were piled in the sink, bed linen was changed at their discretion, and a new package of towels that I was saving for real guests disappeared without a trace from the pantry, guests invited by me, not imposters who intruded without permission. I counted the days until they left with the eager hope with which a prisoner marks lines on the wall of a cell, and when Friday finally arrived, the long-awaited, promised, almost sacred one, I felt a huge weight lifted from my shoulders as I drove home from work, wishing I could finally breathe freely, stay at least once again, alone with myself, without these fake smiles and passive aggression, without trying to control my life under the pretext of caring. It seemed to me that even if returning to life with Leonardo and Vanessa would not be ideal, it was still better than the four of them together, especially with her parents, whose stay in the house had long exceeded any reasonable measure. As I turned onto my street, I mentally rehearsed the conversation that I had firmly decided would take place tonight. I was going to calmly but clearly tell Leonardo that it's been 3 months now, and it's time to discuss a specific timeline for moving, finding a job, and starting an adult life. But as soon as I drove up to the house and approached the front door, all my determination was replaced by anxiety, because my suitcases were neatly, but obviously hurriedly, in the hallway. My suitcases. At first I couldn't believe my eyes, and then, coming closer, I opened one of them in complete confusion. Inside were my clothes, hastily folded, some even carelessly crumpled, underwear was lying on top of business suits, toiletries were mixed with chargers and books, and someone had casually stuffed my cosmetics into a side pocket, as if it didn't matter. I heard voices from the living room and, my heart beating loudly in my chest, like in the chest of a person who finds himself in his own house, but is not recognized by him. I entered there, not hiding my shock. Leonardo, Vanessa, Linda, and Robert were standing there in a tight group. They were looking at something, perhaps a guest list or an accommodation plan. I asked loudly, not trying to hide the tremor in my voice, "Why are my things packed?" All four of them froze for a moment, looked at each other, and only after a few long seconds did Vanessa shrug her shoulders, as if it was some trivial mistake. "We are planning to have a party in honor of my parents' 35th birthday," she said with a slight smile, "and all our relatives will come tomorrow." I blinked at him. "Here?" I asked, and my voice turned icy. "It's just for the weekend," Leonardo added with that same dismissive calmness that made you want to throw something at the wall. "We thought you could stay at a hotel, or my parents. We need a place for guests." I stared at them, stunned. They really, without a shadow of a doubt, without consulting me, decided to kick me out of my own house to throw a party, which they didn't even bother to notify me about. "This is my house," I said slowly, and my voice was trembling not with weakness, but with rage, and it's not up to you to decide who stays here and who doesn't. If anyone should go to the hotel, it's your relatives," Linda snorted loudly. "Don't be ridiculous, we can't ask the family to stay in a hotel," she said, as if it were something completely unthinkable. "But you can ask me to leave my own house," I said through gritted teeth, shocked by this level of insolence. "It's just for one weekend," Vanessa added with a lazy grin. "Don't be so selfish." "Selfish?" I barely stifled a scream, I repeated, and my voice cracked. "I have allowed you to live here for free, for 3 months, I buy food, pay the bills, put up with your complete lack of respect for my space, for my life, and now you're packing my things, kicking me out to have a party here that I'm not even invited to participate in?" "You're being dramatic," Vanessa said, rolling her eyes. "It's just a weekend." I looked at her, then at Linda and Robert, and finally at Leonardo, from whom, despite everything, I still expected at least the slightest intervention, an explanation, an admission that they had gone too far. "I want your parents out of my house by tomorrow," I said, each word like a blow, "and there won't be any party here, is that clear?" Linda gasped, as if I'd hit her personally. "You can't do that, we've already invited everyone," she whispered. "Look at me," I said coldly, turning to Leonardo. "I expected more from you." At least he looked ashamed, but as always, he didn't say anything, not a single word in my defense, not a single glance that would say, "I'm sorry." I went up to my bedroom, slamming the door so that the house shook, sat down on the bed, but immediately jumped up. My hands were shaking, my thoughts were racing, and my whole body was gripped by a mixture of anger, resentment, and the deepest disappointment. I took out my phone and, unable to hold back, dialed my mom's number. My fingers were shaking so much that I could barely press the numbers I needed. "Mom," I said as soon as she answered, "Leonardo and Vanessa are trying to kick me out of my own house to throw her parents' anniversary party. They even packed my things." There was a pause. "It's long and hard." Finally, Mom spoke. "Leonardo mentioned something about a small meeting." Her voice was careful, as if she knew in advance what she would hear. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You knew, and didn't say anything?" "Well, yes, it seemed reasonable to me. It's just for one weekend. Ilaria, why don't you stay with us? It would give you a little break from all the fuss." I felt like everything was collapsing inside, as if the ground was falling away under my feet. It was a moment when it became clear that my parents were not just observers, they were part of it all. "I have to go," I said, put down the phone and slowly, with some empty ringing in my head, sank to the floor next to my unpacked bag. I tried to make sense of what was happening, sitting on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by other people's voices, other people's decisions and suitcases, which, despite the fact that they were mine, were not collected by me, but by the hands of people to whom I once opened my house without fear, my own family, people whose faces were closer to me than the faces of many friends with whom I shared childhood memories, holiday tables, and family misunderstandings, were now trying to actually take over my space, ousting me from it as an unwanted memory. And my parents, the very ones from whom I might not have expected unconditional support, but always hoped for justice, openly sided not with me, but with those who did not even try to hide their neglect. I was offended, I was angry, I felt humiliated, but most of all, I was determined to reclaim what rightfully belonged to me: home, peace, dignity. When I woke up early on Saturday morning, earlier than usual, with a clear head and a plan as clear as a well-learned lesson, I listened for a moment. The house was surprisingly quiet, as if everything had died out. I checked my phone, 7:15 a.m., perfect. I cautiously opened the bedroom door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. As I tiptoed downstairs, I saw what I expected: no voices, no footsteps, not the slightest sign of anyone. They left, as they said yesterday, to get the party supplies. The party was supposed to start in the evening, and for now they were busy shopping. This was my chance. Last night, after the humiliating scene with the suitcases, I pretended that I was giving up, that I was giving in, that I was washing my hands of it. I went down to them, put on a tight smile, and looking Vanessa straight in the eye, I said that they might be right, that I was too emotional, too selfish, and it would probably be wiser if I just went to my parents for a while. Later, Mom called back, and I, not without effort, told her the same thing. "Good girl," she said with satisfaction, and I imagined a note of triumphant relief in her voice. Leonardo looked relieved, Vanessa looked smug, as if she had completed another chess game with a perfect checkmate, and Linda and Robert were glowing with a sense of triumph, as if they had already ticked the box next to the item C's Ilaria's house. They couldn't even imagine what really happened the moment I went up to my bedroom and locked the door. I took out my laptop, found a 24-hour locksmith, called 3, chose the most operational one. His name was Mike and arranged for him to arrive early in the morning. He promised to be with me no later than 8:30. I didn't sleep most of the night, going over possible scenarios in my head, rehearsing lines, thinking over every detail, and now that the house was empty, I got down to business. First, I methodically collected all Leonardo and Vanessa's belongings: clothes, shoes, toiletries, Vanessa's cosmetics scattered around my bathroom, all their bags, laptops, even the coffee maker, which they had put in the living room for some reason. I packed everything neatly in suitcases and travel bags. Then I did the same with Linda and Robert's belongings. With the same respect for their personal space that they had never shown for mine, Mike arrived at 8:30, a tall, polite man with a tired face but tenacious hands. By 10 in the morning, all the locks in the house had been replaced, on the door, at the back entrance, in the garage, and even in the utility room. I paid, thanked him with sincere relief, and while he was driving away, I took all the suitcases and bags out onto the front lawn. They stood in rows, like silent witnesses to what was happening. Then I poured myself a cup of tea and settled on the couch in the living room, just waiting. I was ready. Around noon, a car pulled into the driveway, the same one in which they had left in the morning. Leonardo, Vanessa, Linda, and Robert poured out of it, laden with bags, jewelry, and balloons, as if they had just returned from a New Year's Eve bazaar. Their faces shone at first, until they saw the suitcases. They stopped in place and exchanged glances. They came to the door. Leonardo, as usual, took out the key, inserted it into the lock. It clicked, but did not open. He tried again. Ilaria, he called, the key doesn't fit. I went to the door, but I didn't open it. That's because I changed the locks, I replied calmly, almost matter-of-factly. There was a silence so thick that even the birds in the trees seemed to have quieted down. What? Screamed Vanessa. Open the door immediately. No, I said firmly, I want you all to leave my property. You can't do this, Linda protested, her voice high and harsh. Our party is tonight, people have already been invited. You should have thought of that earlier, I snapped. Before you tried to kick me out of my house. Leonardo came closer. Ilaria, please, let's talk. No, Leonardo, I interrupted, you took advantage of my generosity, lived here for free, allowed your wife and her parents to treat me like an outsider, and now you're going to throw a party where I have no place. This is my home. The conversation is over. Vanessa started knocking on the door, then pounding with her fists. You can't do that, let us in, or I'll call the police. Come on, I said calmly. I'll be happy to tell you how you voluntarily moved in with me, refused to move out and tried to survive me. I'm sure they'll be very interested. Leonardo tried to speak again. Little sister, please, where should we go? It's not my concern anymore, I said. You've had 3 months to figure it out. Time's up. Linda was now wailing about her ruined anniversary. Robert was unsuccessfully trying to calm her down, and Vanessa had gone from punching to kicking, which made the front door shake. If you damage my property, I will call the police, I warned, and the blow stopped. Leonardo said the last thing, Mom and Dad will find out about this. I'm sure they will, I replied. Now, please leave, until I called the authorities. A new wave began, arguments, attempts to pressure, pleas, threats, even Linda's tears, but I didn't give in anymore. I was not the kind of woman who doubted, hesitated, and lived in the hope that someone would finally begin to appreciate her kindness. No, I stood at the door, as hard as a rock, and did not open it. At some point, I heard the suitcases begin to be loaded into the trunks. I went to the window and looked out, not hiding. Leonardo and Vanessa are in one car, Linda and Robert are in the other. I watched them drive away, and for the first time in 3 months, there was real silence in the house. As expected, my phone rang almost immediately, as if the distance between my mother's anger and her index finger on the smartphone screen was predetermined by fate, and when I saw the name Mom flashed on the display, I didn't hesitate for a second. I dropped the call, because I knew, no explanations, no excuses, no calm words will change her perception of what happened. In her eyes, I have already become a villain who rejected my own family, violated the unspoken agreement that a daughter should always be patient, accommodating, and comfortable. Then the flurry of messages began, one after the other, without pause, without pity. Mom wrote in an anxious, hysterical tone, "What have you done?" And then, "Leonardo says that you kicked them out like strangers. Is that true?" And, without waiting for an answer, she was already accusing, "You're cruel, we're disappointed in you." Dad, in his usual manner, did not write much, but his dry, "Call us immediately, young lady." He sounded particularly harsh, as if he were not my father, but the head of the discipline department. I turned off my phone, made myself another cup of tea, put a slice of lemon and honey in it, sat by the window in the living room, watching the shadows of the trees gently sway in the morning sun, and for the first time in months I felt real peace, the kind that you can't buy, ask for, or beg for. It only comes then, when you finally regain control of your life, in silence, in an empty house, where no one else whispers behind my back, slams doors, or demands space, food, attention, or explanations from me. For the first time I heard my inner voice, clear and strong, and it spoke, "You did everything right." Over the next few days, the messages continued to arrive, as if someone had started a machine of insults and reproaches that did not know how to stop. Angry, disappointed, reproachful, filled with clichés and family morality. I've been called selfish, heartless, and cruel, and none of these words hurt me the way they used to, not because I didn't feel it, but because I've learned to understand the difference between guilt and manipulation. Leonardo didn't lag behind either. He sent a long message written in the style of a dramatic confession, where he announced that he was forever breaking off relations with me, that I had destroyed my family, that he would never set foot in my house again. I didn't answer. I didn't delete the message. I left it as a reminder of what tacit consent and abandonment of one's boundaries can lead to. A week later, I turned on my phone for good, not because I was ready to communicate, but because I was no longer afraid. The messages began to arrive less frequently, slowly drying up, like a downpour tired of pouring into nowhere. I learned from my cousin Emily, who has always been more perceptive than her cheerful voice and constant smile would suggest, that Leonardo and Vanessa are now living with my parents, apparently, after the mask of hospitality fell off and they were confronted with Vanessa's arrogant tone and Leonardo's constant claims. My parents had to reconsider their views. Emily said that Mom and Dad had given them a tough ultimatum: 2 months to find a job and start saving for their own housing, otherwise they would have to move out. I couldn't help but smile when I heard that. The irony was too precise, almost theatrical. Everything I had tried to warn them against, everything they had accused me of exaggerating and being unkind, was now happening to them, only without filters. It's been a month since I changed the locks, and my parents still don't talk to me, and, frankly, I'm absolutely fine with that. In this silence, in this absence of constant calls, advice, comments, and guidance, I felt not emptiness, as they probably imagined, but healing from the long-term role of a good daughter who understands everything, forgives everything, and accepts everything. No more lectures about how my age is the last chance for marriage and motherhood. No more Mom's attempts to attach me to another decent man who just wants to take care of you. No more silly hints that I'm living my life wrong. I found peace in my own home again. I have regained my personal space, the right to privacy, silence, order, and chaos, exactly the way I want them to be. And let someone call me cold or cruel, but if it's selfishness not to let people wipe their feet on themselves and demand respect, then I'm proud to call it self-respect. Maybe someday we'll make up. Maybe one day my parents, tired of the whims of their new tenants, will realize that their golden child was not so perfect at all, and that the one they considered too independent and distant was just trying to live honestly and with dignity. Maybe Leonardo will grow up and learn to take responsibility for himself, not expecting his sister or parents to solve his problems all the time. Maybe Vanessa will realize that family is not a resource that can be milked until it runs out, but people who need to be respected, or maybe not. In any case, I know one thing for sure: I will never be a family rag again. Last weekend, for the first time in a long time, I opened cans of bright paint and repainted the guest bedroom in a cheerful yellow color, such that every time I pass by, I can't help but smile. I started hosting dinner parties for friends again, filling the house with laughter, scents, and warmth that had disappeared with Leonardo and Vanessa's move. I live my life, not the one my parents imagined for me, without a husband, without children, but with peace in my soul, with comfort in my home, and with a sense of inner rightness. This is my life, and I, Ilaria, a 42-year-old woman who once lost her husband but found herself, now I know for sure that I did the right thing, and I'm proud of that. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.